Hi everyone, my name is Dylan Poulus. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the Southern Cross University on the Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia. My research program broadly explores mental health and the psychological determinants of high performance in esports. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the first projects in the world that has tried to understand burnout and personality among esport players. This research is currently under review, so not published quite yet. The first thing I want to do is create a really clear distinction between esports and video games. Now, esports are the competitive and organized playing of video games. So these games are played competitively by nature, not necessarily as a leisure activity that we see with the majority of video games. And what I mean by that is that it's how what determines success in these video games is fine motor coordination, decision making under pressure, and teamwork. So to be really clear, that is how you use your mouse, how you use your keys, and when. So the decision making, when you decide to click the keys and click the mouse. And if it's a team-based esport, how you communicate and organize your characters as a team against the opponent's characters as their team will determine what makes you successful. And that really differentiates it from something like gaming as gambling, where it's not about pulling down the slot machine and hoping that you roll a lucky set of numbers. It is really about what you input into the computer and when you input it into the computer. That's what determines whether you win or lose in esports. Luck really isn't a major component of it. Now, when we compete in esports, the most amateur version of that competition is in the game itself. So in each esport, there is a competitive ranking system that uses a ranking system just like chess, so ELO. Put really simply, if you win, your ELO goes up. If you lose, your ELO goes down. At the most professional level, it looks something like the photo I've got on screen here, where you've got a stadium packed out with tens and sometimes 100,000 people watching in person, and in many cases millions and millions online. You can see if you kind of really focus in that there are two teams of six down the front. There's a trophy or the grand final trophy in the middle of them. This was from the Overwatch League, and these two teams are about to compete for prize money, fame, and glory. This is what I'm talking about when I refer to as esports. A really good way to remember it is that all esports are video games, but not all video games are esports. So that's what we investigated here, and I really want to draw that clear distinction between esports and video games. We then decided to investigate burnout in esports. So it's a cognitive affective syndrome with three factors: a reduced sense of accomplishment. So when the achievement that you used to get for playing at a certain level or achieving a high ELO in game no longer gives you that same sense of accomplishment. Physical exhaustion, so feeling physically drained in response to the demands of training and competitions. Now, for some of you going, what do you mean training or competitions? Well, just like we see in traditional sport, competitive and professional esports players have regimented training regimes for both the games, their physical training regimes and their mental training regimes, and they play competitions. Sometimes these competitions look like tennis, where if you start at the bottom and if you win, you play all the way to the top of a specific competition, and sometimes these competitions look like a rugby league or rugby union season, where you play a set number of games against a set type of a set group of opponents over the course of 6 to 12 weeks, and you have first through to last on that competition standing. And so these players can report physical exhaustion due to those training and competition demands. And the final burnout factor is negative feelings towards your esport. So this is really meant to capture the negative emotion. This is meant to capture the mental fatigue and the negative attitude towards playing your esport. So you're not waking up excited to get into training or excited to get into playing like you used to. And these three factors combined are what we explored in this project as burnout. Burnout is a severe mental health illness, but it's associated with other severe mental health issues like anxiety and depression. We decided to explore it because anecdotally, a lot of professional players are starting to report this as a serious issue. They're reporting either dropping back in their professional commitments or retiring and quitting the esport altogether, citing symptoms of burnout leading to things like anxiety and depression as the direct cause. Building on that, early quantitative evidence suggests that burnout in esport players predicted symptoms of anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. So we thought it was really important and really timely to start understanding what is burnout in esports, what does it look like? To help us best understand it, we decided to look at personality in conjunction with burnout. We know from the traditional sport literature that burnout, or an athlete's experience of burnout, can be influenced by personality factors. Two of the most popular personality factors are mental toughness and resilience. Now, we know with mental toughness through research that I've led that esports players with higher levels of mental toughness used more adaptive coping strategies. And we know that coping is a really important predictor of the experience of burnout in traditional sports. So we wanted to see if mental toughness plays a role in esport athletes' experience of burnout. We also explored resilience. We know that in video gaming populations, higher levels of resilience are associated with lower levels of internet gaming disorder. So it felt correct to look at both mental toughness and resilience for such an exploratory study into burnout. So what were our study aims? Well, the first aim was we wanted to understand esports players' experience of burnout. We wanted to know how do those three factors of burnout, reduced sense of accomplishment, physical exhaustion, and negative feelings towards sport, how do they group and vary across esports players? Secondly, we wanted to understand how mental toughness and burnout might be related to, associated with, or influence any burnout profiles that emerged in our esport sample. So how did we go about doing it? Well, we sampled 453 esports players. Each one of these players had an in-game ranking, so that ELO system that I talked about earlier, their ELOs were all in the top 40% of their chosen esport. So these are players that at a minimum are very competitive esport players within the game's internal ranking system, but at the top end, this sample also included professional players like the ones you saw in that photo I showed earlier, playing on stage in front of a live audience both in person and online. We sampled from the major team-based esports that are popular right now. So Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, League of Legends, Valorant, Apex Legends, and Defense of the Ancients 2. To give you an idea of how popular some of these esports are, the Defense of the Ancients 2 Worlds, so their Tier 1 main competition last year, had a prize pool in excess of $40 million for the competition, and the League of Legends World Championship in previous years has had more than 100 unique online viewers. So the people playing these games are becoming famous, they're making their living, there is a lot of pressure that can be associated with playing these esports at this level of competition. Each of our participants filled out a mental toughness, resilience, and burnout questionnaire. Because we wanted to understand in an exploratory way how burnout profiles exist in an esports sample, we use latent profile analysis because it allows us to identify naturally homogeneous subgroups or profiles within a population, so in our case, esport players, using meaningful descriptors. And as I touched on earlier, we used reduced accomplishment, physical exhaustion, and negative feelings. So we wanted to understand if these factors grouped together, how did they group and what profiles emerged amongst these burnout factors in a sample of esport players. To understand how mental toughness and resilience might differ or be associated with any burnout profiles that emerged from the latent profile analysis, we used a one-way ANOVA. So, what did we find? Well, we found three distinct burnout profiles that emerged across our three burnout subfactors. We named them the low-risk burnout, medium-risk burnout, and high-risk burnout group. In the low-risk burnout group, you can see that roughly one standard deviation below the average was reported by players who fell into this group across our three burnout subfactors. The medium-risk and high-risk burnout groups reported similar scores on physical exhaustion and negative feelings, but what clearly differentiated membership in the high-risk burnout group from the medium burnout risk group was their symptoms of a reduced sense of accomplishment. And that's better illustrated on this slide here. You can see that across our 3 sub-factors, the low burnout risk group was clearly defined well below average across the 3 sub-factors. For negative feelings towards sport, there were similar scores for our medium risk and high risk burnout group. They diverged a little bit for physical exhaustion, but then there is a clear difference in the levels of reduced sense of accomplishment reported by people in the high burnout risk and the medium risk burnout groups. So what were the proportion of our sample in each of these profiles? Well, in the low risk burnout group, we saw 33%. In the medium burnout risk group, we saw 28%. But concerningly, in the high burnout risk group, we saw nearly 40% of our sample. This was the largest group in our sample, and they fell into our high burnout risk group. What we found when we looked for mental toughness and resilience differences across the burnout profiles was that higher levels of mental toughness and higher levels of resilience were associated with lower levels of burnout. Lower levels of mental toughness and resilience were associated with membership in both the medium and high burnout risk groups. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there are 3 distinct burnout profiles that have emerged in our esport sample. Latent profile analysis doesn't always produce 3, 1, 2. It's driven by the data. So we didn't inductively come in with 3 distinct burnout groups. That's what emerged from the data. And concerningly, our highest proportion of gamers were in the high burnout risk group. As I said on the last slide, nearly 40% of gamers reported those elevated levels of burnout and elevated levels across all 3 of the factors of burnout. We know now that high risk burnout and medium risk burnout can be differentiated by a reduced sense of accomplishment. The players who reported the highest levels of burnout that could be leading to these more severe mental illnesses like anxiety and depression are reporting high levels of a reduced sense of accomplishment. So this could be an indicative variable, something that we can look at in future research to better predict and understand how burnout develops in esport players. What we also found was that just like traditional sport athletes, mental toughness and resilience, these personality factors associated with high performance, might actually buffer against the symptoms of burnout. And although we've seen mixed effectiveness of mental toughness and resilience training in traditional sports psychology research, esports and video gamers might offer a new frontier for training and developing mental toughness and resilience in young esport players or adolescent gamers. Some of the limitations of our research. The sample was cross-sectional and only spoke English, and all the data was self-report, so we can't infer any causality. Players were sampled from 7 different esports, so we can't really make any differentiation of the findings between esports. So we don't know the differences between burnout profiles that might occur between some of those esports. And this is a limitation because some esports differ as much as, say, cricket differs from soccer. So future research will need to explore single sample esports. We did report a suboptimal entropy level, but the latent profiles were clearly distinguishable, as I showed you in the results section of this presentation. Future research directions. Well, we need longitudinal studies in clinical and more culturally diverse populations. So what we know about esports is that it has developed most quickly and it is most popular in Asia and Southeast Asian regions. And so if burnout is a problem in Western countries, then it's very important to investigate this in countries where esports and esports culture is a lot more progressed. A lot more young people are playing esports in these cultures, and so future research really needs to investigate burnout in non-English speaking samples. As I touched on the last slide, we need to study things like burnout in a single esport. It makes recruitment very difficult, but it's going to help us better develop interventions and work with players who play a single esport to improve their mental health outcomes. We also need to explore how other psychological factors or skills might influence burnout. Now that we know burnout is something that's being reported by esport players, we need to start understanding how other factors like coping and the ability to cope with stress influence burnout. We've seen in traditional sports that how a person chooses to cope with a source of stress strongly predicts their symptoms of burnout. And at the moment, we're working on a study that looks at a network analysis of resilience, coping, and symptoms of burnout. In conclusion, as I said earlier, professional players and competitive players are anecdotally reporting burnout in esports as a serious concern. Our data in this study offers some of the first support for these anecdotal claims. It appears that burnout is emerging as a serious concern among esports players and something that requires more research so that we can protect young gamers and gamers in general against the symptoms of burnout. One way to understand how we might do that might be through helping players develop personality traits like resilience or mental toughness. Just like in traditional sport, it appears that resilience and mental toughness can buffer against the symptoms of burnout. And future research is needed to better understand burnout and its influencing factors. So as I talked about, a good example of this is understanding coping and how esports athletes are coping or not coping with stress. Thank you very much.